In this section, I'm going to talk to you about validation of the switchport configuration. Now, I am only going to discuss a fairly high-level overview of switchport validation. We have talked about VLAN validation in at least a previous exercise, so in one of the previous classes. We're also going to go into a much more thorough validation process in the context of the BGP neighbors that are also in this class. So in this class section. Now, at a high level, if we're talking about validating this switchport config, and let's remember what we had previously configured. So we had started to configure both a set of VLANs and some switchport characteristics, and the switchport characteristics were things like, is the port trunk mode or access mode? What VLAN is the trunk on if it's in access mode? If it's in trunk mode, what is the native VLAN and what are the VLANs allowed on the trunk? So let's think a little bit if we were going to validate the switch port characteristics, what the process would be. So now the first thing you need to work out is you need to work out, one, what you're going to try to verify. So in this case, I think we should verify the mode of the port. Is it access mode or is it trunk mode? And then I think we should start thinking about verifying if it's access mode, what's its VLAN and does that match our specs? If it is trunk mode, what is its native VLAN and what are the VLANs allowed on the trunk? Now, I think ideally we would try to verify these things not from a config perspective, but from using show commands, so more from an operational state perspective. Now, once you've decided that's what I want to verify, then you need to start thinking, what are the commands I should try to execute to verify that? Now, I would add a little asterisk here that since we're dealing with Arista, we generally want to try to verify it through the API because we want to get back straight structured data, i.e. data that we don't have to do string processing on. Or potentially we could try to verify this using napalm, which also gives us straight structured data. So now if you look at this switchvalidate.yaml that I created, so first of all, let me in another window, let me just go ahead and re-push out the configurations to that switch 6. Let me just make sure I'm committing my changes. I am. Go ahead and run this playbook. That should hopefully push that switch port configuration items out to PyNet switch 6. Now here, the very first thing, we're just going to be doing an EOS fax because we're going to be using the Ansible core modules. Now this is not a VLAN verification. This is going to be switch port verification. Now one aspect of using eAPI is you have to use the canonical command names. So you cannot use abbreviated commands. So let's go down to this show interface status and let's look at what it looks like if I drop the S off of it. So if I go from being show interfaces status to show interface status. Let me check my playbook, make sure this is run. Let me check my running config on PyNet switch 6 and just look at what it looks like now on our switch port configuration. Okay, so we see we have our switch port characteristics configured. Access mode, VLAN 700, we have some trunks, we have some more access mode ports, some more trunks. So that configuration was pushed successfully. Now let's go ahead and go back to our switch port validation, run this command, but in an abbreviated form. So we just dropped that S off of that show interfaces status. So here we're testing our connectivity. So we're using eAPI, connecting in using the Ansible core modules. Now notice here that our switch port verification, that it basically completely failed on that command. We cannot use with eAPI in general, we cannot use the abbreviated commands. We need to use the canonical commands. So we'll go ahead and add our S back to show interfaces status. Go ahead and re-execute our playbook, this time with some additional verbose, the -VVV option. Rerun our playbook. Testing our connectivity here, that's complete. Now we're doing our switch port verification. Now we look and we see we get this output back. We notice we have a list. Inside the list, we have a dictionary. And we have a key, interface statuses. And we look and we see inside there, we actually have a dictionary where each of the keys are the interface's name. And we look at each one of these, and let's compare a trunk port to an access port. So it looks like to me that this interface mode, if it's trunked, it's going to indicate to us that the port is in access mode, well, that it's in trunk mode, versus if it's bridged, it's in access mode. So it looks like we can differentiate between that using that command. We then see here that we have an access mode port and we have our VLAN. So here's VLAN 700, VLAN 705. Now, if we wanted to follow on and try to get the trunk characteristics, so things like what's the native VLAN, things like what are the VLANs allowed on the trunk, we'd have to execute a second command. I'm suspecting we might want to do something like show interface trunk, but we'd have to do some additional command, or maybe show interfaces switch port. We'd have to do some additional command to get that information, or some additional command that gave us all the information. So the general process here is going to be figure out what you're looking for. Figure out the map of the commands you need to run to get that information. Once we have the information, like in this case, the trunking versus access mode, we would then just need to process this data structure, get it into a form we could use it in, and then compare it to our starting configuration items, and then do something with that. So flag an error, cause the playbook to print additional debugging messages, have some event happen because we've detected this state. Now, ultimately, we could potentially remediate the issue as well, or at least we could try to remediate the issue. So there's a bunch of options for the action that we take. Now, this is a high-level overview. I'm not, in the case of the switch port, actually going to go through those full set of items.